Scripture is unchanging. God is unchanging. No, it is not. God changes all of the time through social interpretation, through Scripture, through our changing, through our social changes and shifts. So yeah, I think the biggest way gardens impact how I see time is a reminder that things die and time changes. We go through springs and falls and winters. That is all an important part of our theological processes. So when the fundamentalist church says to people like, you're cherry picking God by saying this idea of this fundamentalist theology should die, I would say, really? Because natural systems would say things should die as a part of transformation.
That is Ciarra Jones. She's a writer, speaker, public theologian, also known as the Gardening Theologian. Blending theology, storytelling, and wisdom from the natural world, she is here to help folks untangle inherited beliefs and cultivate faith that is rooted, liberated, and alive. Ooh. She invites communities to learn how tending soil can mirror tending the spirit, shedding systems of control and embracing new growth and nurturing collective healing. A graduate from Harvard Divinity School, she weaves theological insight and practical wisdom to help people reimagine faith for our changing world. This is Unconventional leader Ciarra Jones.
Ciarra Jones, also known as CJ, I ran across you. I was at this event called Ember, and I'm just going to tell you the truth. I'm going to tell you the truth.
Give it to me.
At this conference, they had breakouts where you can kind of go pick your own workshop or whatever. And I had picked out a different workshop. I don't remember what it was. But I got to yapping with somebody, and I was like late. And then I saw that your workshop was starting. And I originally didn't think of that because I saw the word gardening. And I was like, well, I'm not really a gardener. And I was like, you know what? I'm just going to, let's just try this out. And I sat there, and I'm going to tell you, and I'm not BSing you, your workshop was my favorite part of the whole conference.
That is
your message, the way you communicate. I had chills. I was saying amen. I hadn't had said amen in a long time, but I was saying amen. Like, I am tickled to have a conversation with you. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day.
Oh my God. What a freaking honor, Heather. I mean, that means so much to me because something I was telling Heather off the pod is I've been kind of in a place of discerning my work and professional life. And I've had a career both in higher education for years, but I've also had my own consulting firm that does employee well-being, but also religious inclusion. And I just have been feeling like, where is my place? And Ember was a place where I feel like I reconnected with my own voice because I felt like I found so much community that reminded me I had something of value to say. And I really wasn't feeling that way before that conference. So this means a lot to me. And I feel the same about you, Heather. Every day I've been seeing a post that you've created that is mega viral. So many interesting things around sexism, patriarchy, power. So I'm also interested to learn about you and your work. And it's been an honor to be connected. And it's genuinely an honor to me that someone who does such amazing work like you would find value in my work. I feel very appreciative of that.
I'll tell you what, we're about to have a good old steak and time. Let's kind of catch people up. Like on the Instagram, people, you are known as the Gardening Theologian. And I want to start there of what does that mean? And like, why did you decide to go all in with like gardening and theology? Take me back.
Yes. So I first started my, like many people on social media, you start and you have no idea where the heck it's going to go. And you just don't know. You don't know where things will land. So I will say before a few years ago, my TikTok took off, but before that, I did a lot of online content. I was like a Huffington Post contributor on their platform for a long time. Amazing platform that I feel like they could have been like the next Substack. I think about that all the time because basically Huffington Post used to have this program where they had their staff writers, but then they also would say they would see Heather's amazing work online around leadership and all this amazing work. They would be like, Heather, you're an amazing thought leader in this area. Can you come write as a contributor? And Heather could just upload any article she wants into the Huffington Post. The editor will edit it and it goes live. And it was this really cool program. So I name all that to say, before I came on TikTok in Instagram. I feel like I kind of got to, for a decade, hone my online voice in these places where people didn't really know me, but I had a few things go viral, you know. And when I made it my TikTok first, I was a queer theologian because I was like, oh, like maybe like, I don't know. I just felt like, you know, there's not a lot of queer theologians and maybe that would be edgy and stuff.
Yeah.
But that same year I made my TikTok, I rediscovered gardening. My grandfather is a master gardener. My family's from Louisiana, sharecroppers from the South. And my grandpa was in Southern University in the 1950s. He was born in the 30s in Louisiana, Monroe, Louisiana. Drafted out of the Army. I forget, or drafted straight into the Army out of college, like literally out of his sophomore year, taken into the Army. It must have been the Korean War or the Vietnam War. And ultimately, I led my family to Alaska. I led them to Germany. And my mom was born in Kansas City, Kansas, and they landed in California, where my grandfather ended up. My grandparents were my neighbor, and growing up, he just always had this beautiful, flourishing garden. Like, I talk a lot about how I feel very lucky because we have a world that frames masculinity in a very particular way. But I always had this gentle, statuesque grandfather who was like 6'4", who gardened all day, every day, and cooked all day, and really loved the women in his family. And so anyway, my favorite thing about my grandfather's garden is he was my neighbor. So every time I would go out there, I'd see him in the garden, his little sun hat, and he'd always just say like, Ciarra, I'm so excited to see you. You're my friend. Like, you're my friend. Like, and we would just spend time in this garden, this place of flourishing and connection and community. And so I think for me, I chose the name The Gardening Theologian because in my garden is where I've met a God that allowed me to deconstruct a white supremacist God. I met a gentle and kind God, a loving God, a forgiving God, a non-perfectionist God. And the conduit of that is my grandfather. And I have so much gratitude for that for him. So queer theologian is like, it is a part of who I am, queer theology, but I feel like the garden is where I met a God that allowed me to challenge a patriarchal white supremacist God. So it's like an ode to that garden, but it's also ode to my grandfather too, you know, and all he's built in that garden. So that's why I'm the gardening theologian. Sorry, that was long, but that's why.
Whenever, I think you told that story at Ember, but when you said that your grandfather says, there's my friend, I'll tell you what, I'm just a big old crybaby. I will cry every single day. I'm tough AF and I'm strong, but I will bawl my eyes out like in a second. There's something that just stirs in me when you say that. How does earth, how do plants, how did the garden challenge white supremacy?
So many ways. And I'll talk about it both through the secular and religious, although more and more of my work, I just think I don't think they're inextricably linked. I don't think the secular and religious dichotomy exists, but I think in American society, we're getting there finally. So I think I see it. I think the garden gives us so much hope both in the secular and religious. Like when I work in a lot of my consulting, it is with a lot of tech and HR, tech and nonprofit, firms and all these different things. And something I see in workplaces all the time is we make performance so individualistic. You know, a boss will say, if Heather comes in dejected one day, or Heather comes in demoralized one day, or can't do work one day, it all becomes about Heather's failure. It doesn't become about the ecosystem of what Heather might be experiencing that makes it harder for her to thrive there. And I want to give a big shout out to a book that opened my eyes to this, which is Lessons from Plants by Dr. Baranda Montgomery, who is a Black biochemist. And she wrote this amazing book steeped in ecological plant science. And she has this beautiful quote where she says, like, you know, in gardening practice and in ecology, like we never blame a plant for not thriving in an ecosystem, but we do this particularly to minoritized communities. We never see something wrong with the environment they are in. We always say, why doesn't this Black person or this woman or this queer trans person fit in better in this ecosystem? And we see this a lot in workplace performance. We see this a lot in workplace inclusion. So I think the biggest thing gardens give us to help us challenge white supremacy is the idea that anyone can thrive individually. Like the myth of American society is we pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. We need to have the grit to move through our trauma. And if we don't, it is individual failing. And I think both within our workplaces, our healthcare, our churches, we have created a God of individualism and a society of individualism that says our job is to thrive alone. And the biggest lesson my garden teaches me every day is no one thrives alone. Nothing thrives alone. And any system that says people must do this has already failed us through a humanistic lens, or a humanism lens, I should say.
What do you think about this? And I've never really thought about this as a deep embedded fear of mine, but when you were saying all that, it popped up and I'm like, yo, you're afraid of this. when you say that there is a collective responsibility for whatever outcome, and then we need to look at it as the whole, what came up for me instantly was, what if I can't trust the whole or trust the system? That's scary. And I think there's the appeal of individualism, because when I can't trust the system, I don't want to be a part of this system. I want to detach from it. But there's also, consequences with that. So I'm curious how you reconcile that.
First of all, that was I one of my favorite things about coming on other people's podcasts and some of those my own is watching how folks listen and ask questions. That was just such a beautiful question. Thank you, Heather. That made me think about something I hadn't thought about in a long time. And part of something I say all the time is like my queerness saved me from toxic theology, from toxic religion. And when I left the church, I grew up Assemblies of God, Pentecostal. I grew up in Sacramento, California, deep in Pentecostal megachurch. And Assemblies of God is I see them as the birth parent of Hillsong United. So any of your audience that maybe has been in like white non-denominational charismatic churches, you've experienced some of the residual Pentecostal Assemblies of God culture. And what's interesting about Assemblies of God is very white theologically, but is also very diverse, ultimately demographically. Like, so I think even though it has white theological values, my church, for example, was 3,000 people, 25% Black. So I had a lot of people who looked like me within my own congregation. But I name that to say, a part of ecology actually is something which, again, shout out Lessons from Plants. I learned this in this book. Some of the first plants that shape an ecosystem are called pioneer plants. They are the first plants to emerge in a new ecosystem, and they emerge alone. And their life and their death shapes that new ecosystem. And so I do think that I talk a lot about collective flourishing and collective care and showing up for one another as a way to help us rethink our theological values, help us to rethink our workplace values and social values. But there is a part of this work that means standing alone. And I think that's very difficult. I think a lot about Eve as the first woman who stood alone. I think about Eve as the first person in the Bible who I think was crucified. Like, I think we did a social crucifixion to Eve. And something I say about Eve all the time is like, Eve left the Garden of Eden because it was a paradise for Adam, but not her. There are times within our churches or in work or in our healthcare systems or our social systems, someone is thriving, just not everyone is thriving. Like that Adam, if you think about the Garden of Eden, it was a place where Adam had all of his needs met and was given, through biblical texts, a helpmate or someone to be his a helpful person to him, to be his companion. But Eve within that garden was also kind of held to a subservience to Adam and a subservience to God. And so I often see Eve as this brave woman who went into the wilderness, who broke us out of a patriarchal relationship with God to the detriment of herself. She was punished and she was suffered and she stood alone in that bravery. And that bravery was framed as sin. Her curiosity was framed as separating us from God. But I always say I think Eve was our liberator, a woman who went and said, God is beyond this garden. God exists in the universe. God is more expansive. And sometimes we do that walk alone. And I don't think there's an ease to that. I don't want to make that more easeful for people. But I will say for myself, leaving my church after the election of Trump, after realizing I was queer around 2012 and 2013, was so lonely. And I'm so grateful I did it. And it was lonely for a moment, and now I get to sit here with Heather and talk about my work. I get to go to retreats and talk about my work. I get to be in community. So I want to say sometimes we do stand alone, but I think God honors that, because I stood alone and now I stand in community again. It just was a process.
I stand alone, but now I stand in community again. I got chills. If you don't mind, I'd love to hear a little bit more about kind of that breaking off point. One of the things we talk a lot about is just kind of being othered or the outsider, and then the calling. So I feel this nudge, I feel this call, whether it's being honest about who we are and what we believe, and then kind of stepping up, once you get comfortable sharing that, and then stepping up and using your voice and challenging narratives and pissing people off and burning bridges. And that is such a wild ass journey. And I don't know if it ever really ends. But I grew up evangelical Christian Pentecostal, was in Master's Commission through the Assemblies of God. Like, I know that whole world.
Oh, I have questions.
Yeah. Oh yeah. So when you say, coming out and challenging, these narratives and so forth, internally, where did you have to get
Mm.
to own that? Wherever you want to start there.
Such a great question. And after answers, I would love to understand a little more of your history with Assemblies of God and deconstruction. And I have a lot of questions back for you. But I think this is where, again, the garden being where I feel like I keep discovering who God is to me. One thing I will say is in evangelical churches and fundamentalist churches, we want change to be instantaneous. And deconstruction for me is a lifelong process. I see it more as a pruning, like a pruning of a plant or a pruning of a garden. It is very gentle. And I name that to say, like, my process of coming into myself and leaving toxic theology, I think also was very gentle. I think that, like, I found that the God of my mother and the God of womanist theology and queer mother garden God is a lot more gentle than my fundamentalist God around transformation and change. And last thing I'll say there is Octavia Butler says God is change. And I think that that helps us be able to change a little more. But for me, so I grew up in a very fundamentalist Christian family. But what's interesting, and I talk about this a lot, is Black folks, a lot of our families are fundamentalist Christian, but we are not voting red. And that's a really interesting thing is maybe my family did at certain points, buy into sexist or homophobic theology, but we did not buy into those as our political values, which is so interesting. And because I think for Black folks, it's like to vote Republican is to subjugate yourself and your whole community. So even though sometimes we have theological overlap with white evangelical communities, how that works in the political sphere is different. And so I named that to say, I think that left a hole for me to leave toxic religion because my own family, we had this gap with our church. We were never going to vote for Trump. We were never going to be voting red, even though we had some conservative theological values in my household, or I was raised in conservative values. So when I got into UC Berkeley, that's how I actually started leaving the church, is because I got into Berkeley and I'm the fifth person in my family to go to Cal. So my mom, my dad, my brother, sister, and then me, I'm the youngest. And when I got into Berkeley, I didn't know if I wanted to go to Cal, like a Christian university. And my family was like, we really value education, so we'd rather you go to like a 4-year UC. And that value came through. And when I got into Berkeley, my church pulled me aside, my youth group pastor, and they're like, if you go to Berkeley, you're going to Berkeley, you're going to fall into sin, you're going to leave the church, they're going to indoctrinate you into like their progressive values and all this stuff. And at the time, I remember being like, no, like that would never happen. And let me tell you right now, like I think my time at Berkeley taught me the only way you can really uphold living in Christian fundamentalist communities is if you are never challenged scholastically. So even outside of being gay, Heather, most of what my church taught me fell apart in my political science classes, in my African American studies classes, in my ethnic studies classes. None of it held up under critical inquiry. And so I think the church frames, going into higher education as sin, but it's actually a lot of our theologies are paper thin. And like academia pours cold water on that paper thin theology and it falls apart. So some of it was just being in class and learning like, okay, like, no, there isn't just one scripture interpretation, African American. There's Black theology, there's womanist theology, there's queer theology. So I had the cerebral deconstruction. And then also while I was at Berkeley, I very cliche, but I did fall in love with one person on my dormitory floor who was a woman. And like for the first time, I had to really confront my sexuality. And for the first time, I didn't want to fight that. And at that time, I actually called my sister when I was wrestling with my sexuality. And something she said is like, I don't think the God that we were given in our childhood is the fullness of who God is. And she said, you can fracture and fissure and maim yourself for this God, or you can go into the wilderness and find a more expansive God that I think wants to meet you. And that really saved me. And one other thing she said to me that saved me too was, she said, I know who you are. And she said, I know that you would ultimately like to go into ministry. And I know you don't want to be at the pulpit asking someone to not be who they are while you're lying about who you are. And I appreciated that call in too, to say, not get yourself free so you also don't cage someone else. I don't think we think about that enough, but it was that process of academia and my professors kind of nudging me towards inclusive theological scholarship, and then also falling in love and having my sister nudge me. And I see it as kind of all these tiny angels and experiences that led me towards liberation. And I'm curious if that resonates at all with your story or how you kind of ended up in the realm that you are in as well.
I always say going to college, and I didn't go to Berkeley. This was like Arkansas, you know what I'm saying? But I grew up.
All college is good college.
That's it. I was homeschooled my entire life. I was very sheltered. I was not exposed to any other thoughts, right? And so going to college, I was wrecked.
Me
I
too.
was
Yes.
completely wrecked.
Yes.
I'm curious how because you mentioned kind of the calling to ministry. Since I was a little girl, I always said I was going to go into ministry. I used to preach to my teddy bears and stuff. And then when I left ministry, yeah, I was like, y'all are going to listen to me. But when I left the church, it was really interesting trying to wrestle with calling, because I'm a communicator and I know you're a communicator too. And so it's like, what is the container for calling now when it's outside of this container? And I'm curious how you've wrestled with that. And do you use the word calling? Do you think you have a calling? How has that changed and evolved like with you?
Yeah. Oh my God, such a good question. Wow. And I just want to say I definitely resonate with the painful beauty of deconstruction. Like I'm so glad I deconstructed. And something Kate Bowler says in her work is like fundamentalist religion gives us very simple answers to life's complex questions, and leaving that simplicity is painful. It's so much better to feel like I'll ace my college test if I just do this prayer and go to school. It's harder to be like, sometimes you study as hard as you can and you don't get it right. Like those are harder nuances to sit in when you've left fundamentalism. Like even just sitting in nuance and getting out of the black and white. So I just want to say I really resonate. And I think my sense of calling has evolved in the sense of I think calling is a very rigid thing in the fundamentalist church. Like calling, I think, has to look a certain way. It often has to be affirmed by, I think, sometimes people of authority, or we need it confirmed by our religious body, or there can be a lot of complexity in calling, especially around women in ministry and women preachers. My Pentecostal church was okay with women preachers, but they always were women's ministers or children's ministers. I never saw a lead female minister. So I'm going to say I see a complicated kind of intersection also of calling and power and privilege. I also think within the church, right? I also think we don't talk enough about calling and pretty privilege. I feel like particularly having gone to a lot of white fundamentalist churches throughout my youth, it always is very conventionally attractive white men, I feel like, who are seen as having calling within churches, like and they have a conventionally attractive wife. And so I think there's a lot around pretty privilege, calling, power that I don't like. What I do believe in is my garden has changed my sense of calling, because I think now I see calling as a place where we can flourish the most deeply, where we can do our work the most easeful. Like that is where calling is. Tamar Bryant helped me sharpen that perspective, because I recently was at a retreat called We Are Soul Story, which is an amazing place where I was with, Geraldine Henry and Brian Recker and Christian Smith and so many other amazing theologians. And part of the conference, they put us through a lot of different learning modules. And Dr. Tamar Bryant came to speak, she's amazing. She wrote Matters of the Heart and Homecoming. And at the time I told her, I said, I'm wrestling with quitting working within institutional diversity, equity, and inclusion. I want to keep doing it through my consulting, but I don't think I ever want a full-time DEI job in an institution again. And I told her something about working institutional DEI feels like suffering, but I told her I feel like maybe called to this work. And I also feel, and something she said is like, there is someone who is called to this work for whom it is not suffering to do it. And if you are suffering in it, then I would question if it's a calling for you, because your calling will not be where you are suffering. And I think that, right? Like, so I think now I don't see calling as this rigid place. I think for me, what I feel an impetus and a passion towards is getting people free from systems of power and privilege and finding out where I get to do that and I'm mutually thriving too. It was institutional DEI. Now I think it's my DEI consulting and inclusive religious work, and that calling might change form again later on. And so I think our calling is where our ability to liberate others also meets our joy for the work and our ability to be well in the work. That's how I see calling now. And that can shift based on, our conditions. So that means our calling becomes flexible. So maybe our values are the same, but how that calling looks is different. And the last thing I'll say is it's kind of similar. Maya Angelou says, success is liking what you do, liking who you do it with, and liking yourself. And I think that's also kind of an idea of calling that's more flexible too.
What do you think about like following that trail? And I'm curious if there's anything too with gardening that points to this, or
Yes.
you're like, yeah, it does. But
Yeah.
but suffering, because if you think about it, like I've been wrestling with this idea of suffering, because if you think about, you probably were taught this too, just like the passion and the suffering, and you have to suffer for the Lord, and just this attachment to pain and suffering as like holiness. And then don't believe in my bones that's accurate. But then in my mind, I think about, when you're training for like a marathon or getting muscles or whatever, like there's strain and struggle that comes with growth. But there's also a way to weaponize that, where we say it's okay that you're going through something holy because you're suffering. And so they can bypass like our own wrongdoings by calling it holy. And so there's this weird line there, and I haven't been able to decipher through it. So what do you think about that? And like, what does nature teach us about the role of suffering?
That's such a beautiful, beautiful question. I think, I had a video I made like a few years ago because I used to, in fundamentalist Christianity, I feel like I learned my most critical thought of myself is the truest one, because a rigid God who observes us and surveils us calls us to do the same to ourselves. So I felt like at the end of the day, if I could like assess my day and be like, this is where I messed up here, this is where I messed up there, I'm renewing myself. I'm in the process of perfectionism. I saw a self-cruelty as this way of renewing my mind and renewing myself and getting towards this perfectionism that God wants us to get towards. And Buddhism actually frames that as a type of self-aversion, a deep rejection of the self. And Buddhism says, a lot of the systemic inequality we see in the world is because we reject ourselves and we reject others. If my deepest way of relating to myself is I must continue to grow and improve, and nothing about me is good. I am dying to the flesh. I'm renewing my mind daily. I am iron sharpens iron. I am always in an adversarial relationship with myself, and I'm expecting that others are always in this kind of gritty relationship with them. And I also don't believe in systems that make it easier for people to flourish, because I think we are our best when we are suffering, both individually and collectively. It becomes a social reality. And so I think, what's beautiful about plants is like plants respond to affirmation and kindness. There is not a plant that will grow unless they are built like cactuses or other plants, right, that are built to thrive in harsh conditions. If a plant is not built for that, it'll just die. Like, if there's not, like, it doesn't, like, if I don't water my plant, it dies. It doesn't grow in that resilient experience. It dies. If it's a scorching hot day and I don't go out there and check on my plant, it just dies. It does not rebirth from that resilience. And so I think what we do see within our plants is, I made a video once that said, like, my plants taught me that I shouldn't let the harshest thought about myself be true, that the gentlest thought about myself was always true, because to affirm my plants is to see them fully, and to be rigid and punitive towards them means that they won't thrive. We see it in how you speak to them. There's so much research on how you speak to your plant impacts their thriving. So I think the biggest thing I see with plants is like, they don't grow from suffering, they just die from it, most of them. We do see plants deep resilience too. Like I talk about how plants do give us space to see that imperfection is okay. I have overwatered my plants. I have overpruned my plants. I have planted the wrong plants in the wrong environment, and they can still thrive through it. But plants don't overall respond well to suffering, which I think reminds us that we overall don't respond well to it either. And a good gardener would never want their plant to suffer. So I think the question is, why would a good God want us to suffer either,
Sexuality. What have you learned about sexuality through plants?
That's a really good question too. I mean, what I love is I'm a big fan of. She goes by Bright Black Honey on Instagram, and I think Jamila Bradley on TikTok. And recently, she talked about how we do so much to say, which we do in the Christian church. We say like, this is God's law, and we contort ourselves into that law. But we see that a lot of what we say God's law is not the same as what natural systems do. Reverend Dr. Kelly Brown Douglas, in her work, Stand Your Ground, Black Bodies and the Justice of God, talks about something called natural law theo ideology, which is white Christians, particularly white slave master theology's perspective that God ordered the world with white people on the top. Stay with me here. I promise we're going to get to natural systems, right? And we have done a lot within our society and global world to contort ourselves into this. Colonial violence, manifest destiny. We have done everything to contort ourselves and name ourselves into this natural law that white people are at the top. And so we see actually how within like white fundamentalist theology, we actually are pulling from some kind of ecology and ecosystem theory that God actually created an ecosystem that we need to violently uphold, that we need to violently maintain this preconceived of ecosystem. What's interesting about plants is you see that like when a plant comes into an ecosystem and takes over it, it's called an invasive species for a reason, because nothing else can thrive in that ecosystem. White supremacy is an invasive species. It has usurped an entire community, it has usurped an ecosystem, so nothing else can thrive. And so I bring sexuality into this because in an invasive species, yeah, you might not see any gayness. You don't see anything else in that ecosystem. You see the invasive species itself. And you say that that's natural, but actually that species has invaded that whole community. But so if we look at natural plant ecosystems, we will see queerness in those plant ecosystems. ALOC actually just had a beautiful post about this. I really recommend go looking at their recent post about all the different plants where we see queerness happening within those plant ecosystems, where we see queer sex in plant ecosystems, we can see queer connection in plant ecosystems. So I name a lot to say, I think that within our religious fundamentalist idea around sexuality, around identity, around race, we have said there's one right way of being. We can contort ourselves into it. Within natural systems, we will see queerness. We also see collective care, which I think comes from queer communities. And in Lessons from Plants, Dr. Branda Montgomery talks about how plants will often not compete. They only really want to work collectively. They only compete if it's a last resort. So when a plant is next to another plant, which I see as part of queer culture, collective care, collective well-being, they will do everything to not compete with that plant. They will reach out a tendril and touch a plant next to it to see, like, is this a friend or a foe? They will send out electric shocks through their root systems to see how that plant next to them responds, to see, are you a friend or a foe? They will send out gas emissions and see what gas emissions the plant next to them sends back, just to say, how can we be in community with each other? Are you an ally? Can I be an ally to you? And I see that also as a part of sexuality and queer culture. Queer culture has ballroom culture, collective care, mutual aid. Plants do that too. They don't want to be invasive. They don't want to compete. They want to connect and care for each other. And I think that actually speaks to queer sexuality and queer forms of care being in natural systems.
You are lit up.
You think so? I love plants, bro.
I love seeing someone lit up. I love seeing it. You know, when you were talking.
Also, I want to clarify, this looks like wine. This is coffee. I love drinking fancy glasses out of. I wanted to clarify our audience. This is not like a 1 p.m. espresso martini. It's just straight coffee.
All good on my end. The thing about, like, maybe I'll use the word conviction. Like, you're convicted in what you believe. And one of the things I've been wrestling with is the tension between conviction and being in love with mystery and a space for mystery.
That's for you.
Because back to the school thing, you know, you said, how did school impact your life? When I first got there, my degree was in counseling. We were supposed to write this paper on what is your ideas about the human condition and mental illness. And when I got to school, I'll tell you what, I wrote. I had to stop writing because I had so many thoughts, so many opinions. I just was I knew what was going on with the world. When I left school, we rewrote the same paper because he wanted us to revisit that idea and see what's changed over those years. And it was the hardest time writing a freaking page because I'm like, I don't know. And so for me, education was so powerful because it made me realize how much I don't know and how I love how much I don't know.
Yes.
But then as a communicator and our, role, obligation, whatever word you want to use in this current climate, to use our voices and speak up and have conviction and all that, I wrestle sometimes with being convicted versus still saying, I don't know.
Yeah.
I threw up on you, but what do you think about all that?
No, you didn't. Oh my gosh. Heather, I would want to listen to you talk forever. So please do not say this is like such a life-giving, rich, joyful conversation. When I used to teach vacation Bible school, which back in the day, we used to teach kids about something called, I know, right? That's some throwback, vacation Bible school. But we used to teach the kids something called God sightings, which is just where do you see a little bit of magic in your day? I did a God sighting just getting to be in conversation with you. It's such a blessing to me. I'm reading right now, which Heather, you need to read this right now, based on what you just said, which is The Four Vision Quests of Jesus by Stephen Charleston. I've been reading it off and on for like 2-3 months now, and it is all about indigenous perspectives of Christianity and how within Western conceptions of Christianity, we want to know. And something he says so beautifully in that text is, indigenous perspectives of Christianity, God is mystery. To go deeper into mystery is to go deeper into God. And so I think for me, it's actually the more we don't know, the more we know God, which is not what feels comfortable, but is true. Like if I went on my page, so I will say that book has helped me get comfortable with mystery, which is why I just highlight that work. I think everyone should buy it. And I love that he highlights that. But it also, I mean, you and I are both public educators and public teachers. And I think there is a fear to not know in that arena. But I love not knowing with my audience because then it means I'm turning them back to themselves. I don't want them to come to me for the answers. I want them to know that they were already born with the faculties and tools to take all this information and come to the answer for themselves. And then, in fact, I will know God less if their only answer about God is my answer. I want to know God through Heather. I want to know God through my audience. So I want to give them the tools to tell me something about God I don't know. And I definitely have people that comment on my stuff sometimes that are like, that want certainty from me and I don't give them certainty and they're upset, or they want to know what I believe and I tell them I'm a pluralist and I'm seeking and they're upset because they want an answer from me. But I know that I will be a better public theologian and teacher and consultant if I turn people back to themselves with the information to say, I just had my deconstruction group actually. And a lot of folks were like asking me what I believe and what I think and what they should think. And I said at the end of this, what you will have at the end of this talk is not all of my answers. What you have is safe resources to come to better conclusions. What you will have are safe people to go to ask and wrestle with these questions. And I think that's our work. And the last thing I said to them is, like, even for ourselves in the progressive realm of theology, like if I started saying God is a lesbian mother and I said God is nothing else, I'm engaging my own kind of supremacy because I'm saying God can never be something else. And so even though my interpretation seems radical and progressive now, in 1,000 years, that could really harm society, that I said God is a lesbian mother who's unchanging. So I also don't want to be a part of putting forward ideas of God that are unchanging. I want us to see God as an ever-evolving praxis of community and collective definition. And I think if we're doing that, we're doing good work. That's how I think about it.
What are we so afraid of?
You should have an NPR podcast. You be asking questions like NPR. Like I would watch this. I would be on the New York Times app right now eating this up. I want you to know, like, you're such a good podcast. We are afraid that if we leave certainty, we will lose ourselves and we will lose God. But God and ourselves were never in certainty. Like, we are also in mystery. We are also in change. We are in transformation. We are in the unknown. I went through a huge life transition a couple years ago. I'm in an amazing partnership now, but a couple of years ago, I went through a major breakup, which is probably I'm 32 now, and I went through a major breakup around 28, 29. And we're together about 4.5 years. So that was the closest I've experienced to a true divorce. It felt like a divorce for me. Like, just our lives are very enmeshed and all these different things. And I just didn't believe, before I met my partner now, a new community now, I was very, very depressed with that breakup because I just didn't believe, I could not envision a life beyond what me and that person had built. I could not envision joy beyond I had no vision for what could be outside of that. And that led to a lot of depression and anxiety and sadness. And then I look at my life now and it is so full in ways I could not have even imagined or seen when I was in the depth of that depression. And I was in that depression, that some of that depression was coming from certainty. My certainty that life would never be better than what I experienced. My certainty that I had experienced all the goodness available to me. My certainty that I had failed by not being able to maintain that relationship. My certainty and my shame that I wasn't able to uphold that my certainty that I had fucked it all up, to be honest. And I was so wrong about what I was so certain about. And there was so much flourishing and the mystery beyond the years of that relationship and that life. And so I think we are so afraid of the uncertainty. We are afraid of the Eves, the curious, the ones that go into the wilderness. We're afraid of the women who leave seemingly good marriages. We're afraid of the women who leave seemingly good jobs. We're afraid of the queer and trans people who leave churches and say they're going to be ourselves because we've decided that's a barren land. But actually, God's all up in there. God's all up in that land we said is barren. God's all up in that land we said is wilderness. So I think that's what we're afraid of. That certainty may destroy us, but I think uncertainty will free us. Uncertainty is our liberation.
We're going to church. We didn't know we were at church, but we are. Golly, Lord Jesus. What about time? I want to hear how your understanding, perception of time has evolved or plans.
Oh my God, you asked this question. My God, today. Because, so my brother is, I'm very lucky to be in a family of academics. I will also say, Heather, that is why I don't care anyone comments to me online, because I'm like, no one could ever have a more incisive argument than my mother, my brother, or my sister. So it's like, don't even worry about it. So my brother, my dad is a surgeon, and my sister has her master's in dance and cultural anthropology. My brother is a doctor of cultural anthropology. My mother is a teacher. And so I have so much rich conversation in my own family system. And
What a gift.
my brother, it's such a gift. It's such a gift. And my advisor at Harvard was a cultural anthropologist. A lot of people don't realize a lot of anthropologists are in religion. And something my brother and I were saying yesterday is anthropology's biggest contribution to religion is anthropologists said like sociology. We were just talking about this yesterday, how sociologists have often made religion all about belief and community. The anthropologists were like, could some of this be about power? Could some of this be about the maintenance of harm? Could some of this about, could this be problematic? Could some of religion do harm? And that's what anthropologists started to contribute to the realm of religion. And I name this to say there's a phenomenal book called Aslan and Arcadia. And it's all about how American communities have laid claim to Jesus and Central Americans have laid claim to Jesus by placing Jesus within different landscapes of time, by saying that Jesus exists in different linear realities. And by making different claims to time, Central American communities have been able to lay claims to Jesus in really interesting ways. They've laid claim to Jesus as the God Quetzal, which would mean that actually Jesus is predated by the Jesus of the Bible. It's a really interesting book about spatial temporal reality and how that is also defined through race and identity and power. And so I named that to say, even outside of plants, being mentored by anthropologists in grad school and having a brother who's an anthropologist helps me think a lot about time and power and Western claims to time as a way to also lay claims to God. And I wish I could say a little bit more concretely. I haven't read Aslan and Arcadia in a long time, but it's a phenomenal book that will really make you think about time and reality. But plants make me think about time also because gardens exist cyclically. Plants die. The most important thing about gardening, tying garden theology to me, is that plants die. I think that white supremacist theology is about creating theologies that allow us to circumvent death in certain ways, to circumvent death, discomfort, grief, loss, pain, trauma. In fundamentalist churches, for example, as I've highlighted, if a queer person suffers, it is because they were not Christian enough, not because our theologies are harming. If a person dies, we often focus on kind of bypassing our grief and just focusing on how they went to heaven. And we don't really have a lot of language to talk about this. When our marriages fail, we don't have a lot of language around this. And so I name this to say, gardens for me have helped me understand that serving God is not all about just prosperity and circumventing death and circumventing harm, because things die. Our theologies might die, our sentiments might die, things might change, things are cyclical. And I name this because I actually just did a video response to a guy who said, we can never argue that queerness should be seen by God as good because scripture is unchanging. God is unchanging. No, it is not. God changes all of the time through social interpretation, through scripture, through our changing, through our social changes and shifts. So yeah, I think the biggest way gardens impact how I see time is a reminder that things die and time changes. We go through springs and falls and winters. That is all an important part of our theological processes. So when the fundamentalist church says to people like, you're cherry picking God by saying this idea of this fundamentalist theology should die, I would say, really? Because natural systems would say things should die as a part of transformation. So is this death actually giving us something? Are we composting it? Are we alchemizing it? Is it part of the process? Every year when I build a garden, I use dead leaves to compost it. I use manure to compost it. That is shit and leaves in my garden. Those might be byproducts that we think are useless, but gardens make use of them. So I know maybe that wasn't a direct answer to time, but I think maybe what I see within white fundamentalist theology is trying to circumvent death, trying to say our theology should be stagnant and unchanging. And gardens say all things change, all things transform. My grandfather always says, time and tide waits for no man, meaning things will always change. The ocean does not wait, time does not wait. And I think white supremacy thinks it can stop time and tries to make us arrested in white concepts of time. And we suffer for that. But natural systems say white supremacy can't fight time either. It will change, even when white folks don't want it to. And I think we have that happening now. Even what Watson will say is, even being anti-DEI, being anti-affirmative action, anti-inclusion, that is all white people trying to fight time and tide. But it waits for no man. That's the first time I understood my grandpa's phrase, actually.
Your family sounds so cool.
They're a cool freaking group, man.
Wow.
They're a cool group.
You know what came up for me when you were talking about the change thing? It's so weird. And maybe this is normal with plants. I don't know. I'm just now kind of getting into that whole vibe. But outside we have like this pot, and it had a plant in it, and it died, and we just left it out there. It was just chilling. It was probably just a minute. It was probably, goodness, maybe even 6 months. I don't know. It was a long time that it was just like this empty pot. And then all of a sudden we saw like a new plant come up. But what was so weird about it is it wasn't the plant that died. It was like something completely different. And it just grew. And I was so moved by that. I mean, heck, a seed could have just dropped in there from a bird. I mean, who knows? But it was just so cool that something died and something completely new, a completely different plant came up on its own.
What I talked about, when I mentioned the gardens are cyclical. So even, when we come into periods of death, it will come into rebirth. I posted on my page this week if folks want to look at it. An agave plant, plants at the end of their life cycle, they death bloom. They build this, they grow, they live to 10 to 30 years. Ours lived about 25. And then it grew like a 60 to 80 foot tree, like just out of it. And it's stunning. Like you just look at it and it's like a wonder. I mean, it really is a wonder to look at a death bloom, but it is dying. And it just goes out in this phenomenally beautiful way. And I think plants remind us, like I said, white supremacy is so afraid of death. But if we look at Buddhism, if we look at I think about this with Ethiopian communities. When someone dies, they go into 40 days of collective mourning, where they cry together, they scream together. But that actually helps the grieving process because there's an acknowledgement of death. And it's not the end. Community is coming together to say it's something new. Your plant reminds us there's something new. And so I think, the thing that I get all the time in my work is, if you're saying God is not white and male and rigid, then we're cherry picking God. We're always cherry picking God. We are always coming together to decide who God is and God is not. It's not really about truth, it's about power. We allow white men to cherry pick God, but when black people say who God is, we say, oh my God, we're cherry picking God. God is always socially defined. And so really when we're doing this work to say, that these ideas should die, it's disingenuous when we say nothing else can come again. We see it in natural systems, another idea can come. In Black theology, for example, I listen to Christian Smith preach about Sodom and Gomorrah, where we always say, that queer people are bad in Sodom and Gomorrah. He repreached that passage, and all he said is, this isn't about queerness, it's about sexual violence and sexual assault. And we need to think about how sexual violence works in our communities and in our churches. Yes, he allowed a concept of God to die there, but something else rose up that I think is even more important, which is how we care about the sanctity of each other's bodies. And so I think the myth of progressive theology is we just let God die and nothing else rises. But just like your plant, when we allow a concept that's choking us to die, we actually give space for something else to come. And I think that's what this work is if God is not this, God is something else. We don't just stop at the who God is not. I'm excited to see that new movie, Is God Is. I don't know what it's about, but I even love that title, like Is God Is, who is God? We're doing that work together. And that's okay. It doesn't mean we're cherry picking God. It means we're expanding the margins of God, as Father Gregory Boyle says in his work. And that's good work, y'all. That's the good work, I think.
I need everybody listening this to go click the link in the show notes and follow the Gardening Theologian. I'm going to tell you, and I mean this from the bottom of my heart, no BS. When you speak, my heart just feels like it's going to burst out because you are so full of life. You're full of life. And I'm so grateful that I met you. Thank you for the work that you're doing in this world. I know you're just getting started. Is there anything you want to direct our listeners to so you can get out of here?
Yeah. Well, first I want to direct them to all of your work, Heather, the podcast, Heather's Instagram. I don't know if you're on TikTok. I follow you on Instagram. If you're on TikTok, please go to Heather's TikTok. Your work is phenomenal. Your critiques are incisive, and you're bringing something new to the world where people can find solace and community. So thank you. I like to always take a moment when moments feel like miracles. And this feels like a real miracle based on just some of the things I've had to wade through and work through to get to this point in my own career. So thank you for celebrating my work. Like being here with you today is a miracle. I would love for folks to check out my Substack, Sacred Descent. I'm really proud of some of the work that I'm able to build out there. You can see the work I do with organizations and individuals at ciarrajonesconsulting.com. And you can check out my new podcast, the Community Garden Podcast, on Spotify. I'm working on a new name for that podcast. So if your audience has ideas, if you have ideas, let me know. I just saw there's another Community Garden Podcast, so I don't want there to be two of them. So I'm working on another name. But right now we're the Community Garden Pod, and we just had some great episodes of Colton Barnaby and Christian Smith and Spencer Helms, Nick Young's life. And we've all been talking about theological transformation, religion as a social determinant of health. And I'd love for your audience to tune in. So I'm so honored. Thank you for having me, Heather, and thank you for your time today.